I think you should all be able to see my slides now. Please interrupt me if you can't see them. So welcome everyone today to my talk on conducting online research with blind participants. And I'm first going to take you through our reasoning for why we actually decided to conduct our research with blind participants online, because it's maybe not the first thing you would expect. So to start, our research question is, to what extent do our senses shape our knowledge of the meanings of words? And research with individuals who experience the world in an atypical manner is key in answering this type of question. But participants who are blind, for example, may find it difficult to come to the lab. And of course, as people have mentioned before, if you recruit online, then you can reach a much larger sample. And this was a great benefit for us, especially because the pool of participants is already quite small. And let's also not forget the elephant in the room, which is the current COVID-19 pandemic, which was really the deciding factor for us. So in this talk, I'm going to take you through the steps that we took to move our research online. And for us, the first step was to switch to presenting stimuli auditorily. And this is perhaps the most usual mode of presentation for many of you, but for us, it was certainly new. And because it was new, we did some reading on timing issues associated with auditory stimuli. And we found that especially Bridges et al. Warn against measuring reaction times in online experiments when you use auditory stimuli, because differences in the participants' hardware and software may compromise the accuracy and precision of these measurements. So the first thing that we actually did was try to find out whether reaction time measurements would be good enough for our purposes. And we did that by including a visual and auditory simple reaction time task in our pretest with sighted participants. And in these tasks, participants just simply pressed the button as soon as they heard or saw the stimulus. And we then compared the data that we gathered online against data that our colleagues had collected in the lab. And for those who are interested, you can preview and clone these tasks via Gorilla Open Materials. So the data, when we look at the data, I'm going to first take you through the mean reaction times, and these give you an indication of the between participant variation in the data. And here we can see quite clearly that the variation in means was indeed greater in the online data for the auditory task than in the lab-based data, and the test of homogeneity of variance also proves this. And this suggests that differences in software and hardware do indeed impact on the accuracy and precision of online reaction time measurements when you use auditory stimuli. And this in turn can make it difficult to detect between participant effects. When we look at the visual task, however, there seems to be slightly more variation in the online data again, but this time the test of homogeneity of variances was not significant. And if we take a look at the standard deviations of the reaction times, which give an indication of the within participant variation, then you can see that actually the online data and the lab-based data look very, very similar. And this is also what the homogeneity of variance tests showed. So the variances for the auditory task for the lab and the online data were essentially the same, and the same was true for the visual task. So we actually had to run our pretest again because we had to make some changes to the initial design. So we ended up replicating our findings and reproducing them. As you can see here, the pattern in the data looks almost exactly the same as in the previous graphs that I showed you. So this led us to conclude that between participant variation was indeed greater in the online task with auditory stimuli, but the within participant variation was similar in both the online and lab-based data, regardless of the mode of presentation. So in other words, we were reassured that it should be possible to detect reaction time effects if you use a within participant design, and that was our plan anyway. So we carried on with our experiments, and in the next part of the talk, I'm going to take you through the further steps that we took to ensure accessibility for blind participants. So here our starting point is that blind participants navigate the web using a screen reader and or a braille display. So whatever's on the screen is read out to them or shown on a braille display, which is at the bottom of their keyboard. And of course, they also don't use the mouse, so all functionality must be tied to the keyboard. And before I take you through the things that we changed, I want to note that happily, we didn't actually have to change too much compared to how we would normally set things up with sighted participants. And this was really great. But of course, there were a few things that we did have to change. So because blind participants use a screen reader or a braille display, navigating the web is a much more linear process for them. So we write our instructions much more like spoken language. We use simple words and short sentences, and we also repeat things a lot more often than we would probably do if we were designing experiments just for sighted people. We also keep our formatting to a minimum because this isn't usually read out by a screen reader or displayed on a braille display. But we do use HTML tags for things like headings because that information is presented to blind participants as well. We also provide extra tips for our blind participants on how to navigate through the experiment. So in tasks, for example, the screen reader has a tendency to skip immediately to the button at the bottom of a screen if there is one, which means that participants may accidentally skip the instructions that are on the screen, which is of course not something that you want. So we have a level 1 heading at the top of each page with instructions, and we tell participants that this is the case and that they should always make sure to start from this level 1 heading and navigate down the page before they click on the next button. We also had to change a couple of things when it comes to task functionality and responding. So obviously everything needs to be presented auditorily. Which means that fixation crosses, for example, become fixation beeps. And because we have lots of these auditory stimuli, we use a very helpful script that Gorilla provided that lets us preload our stimuli at the start of a task so that participants aren't faced with any loading delays during the task, which might make them think that the task is frozen. And the thing that we actually had to spend the most time on was to make sure that our response buttons worked. Because it turns out that nearly any key on a standard keyboard is a command key of some kind for most screen readers, and these differ between screen readers as well. So we had to do a lot of testing and fine-tuning the instructions that we provide to participants to temporarily turn these command keys off during parts of the experiment when they need to respond, and then back on again when they have to read instructions on the screen. We also did a lot of piloting, as people have mentioned before, and we piloted both on sighted and blind participants. And for us, it was also really helpful to contact some organizations that work with and for blind people, and they really helped us figure things out in the early stages of design, and they could tell us all about how screen readers interact with web pages to help us fine-tune those instructions. As Simone did as well, we provide extra support via email and phone call, or preferably video calls, because as she said, participants can then share their screen with you, and you can basically guide them through the experiment at a distance. And then we also make sure that the experiment for sighted participants is exactly the same, and this kind of goes without saying, but I'm mentioning it anyway because it may require a warning to your sighted participants that nothing will be shown on screen during parts of the experiment, like the trials, because this is very counterintuitive for sighted people, and they might think that the experiment has crashed or something. So what do I want you to take away from my talk today? The first is that reaction time measurements collected in online experiments with auditory stimuli are precise enough for most purposes, at least if you use a within participant design. And the second is that conducting research with blind participants online requires a bit more thought, but it is certainly possible and may also be preferable if your participants find it difficult to travel to the lab. And as I've said before, it allows you to recruit much more widely and reach a much larger sample size than you might otherwise be able to. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ava. Thank you for that. The Q&A is open. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, I will start with my question, and that will be the only question. But you can keep asking them because Ava will be able to answer them. Here we go. There's a question about your platform. So which platform were you using for this testing?
I'm not sure what is meant by platform exactly.
Which kind of online testing system were you using?
I mean, yeah, we were testing in Gorilla, and the participants were recruited through word of mouth mostly.
So that makes sense. Thank you.